of Auto. Good day to you all. My name is JJ Hornblath. I serve as executive editor and publisher of Auto Finance News, and I'm pleased to welcome you to 5 Most Effective Collection Strategy Improvements, a webinar presented by the Center for Auto Finance Excellence, the new industry resource that shares best practices and actionable advice with auto finance professionals. The Center for Auto Finance Excellence was launched by Auto Finance News in partnership with Fiserv last July, and we're pleased that you're a part of this webinar today. This is the second of a series of webinars presented by the Center through the generous support of Fiserv, and we certainly are appreciative of that support. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Craig Carroll, Vice President, Automotive Strategy at Fiserv, for some welcoming remarks and the introduction of our speaker today. Craig, take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody, or I should say good morning, depending on where you are. But again, as JJ mentioned, my name is Craig Carroll. I've been with Fiserv about 23 years now. Fiserv basically does a lot of system development work in the auto finance space. We have a very large loan origination system as well as servicing platforms. And the office I work out of, which is in Amherst, New York, we actually do servicing. So we're handling the collections for about 175,000 accounts, and we're in the process of building our next generation of collection software. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this webinar and all its content today. During this webinar, which will last about 30 minutes and will be recorded, Marcy Bellis, the senior editor of Auto Finance News, will present on how companies can enhance their existing collection practices at a time when rising delinquencies and charge-offs are starting to creep into lender portfolios. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer session where everybody has a chance to ask any questions and participate. The substance of this conference is just some of what we're doing at the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. It was developed for the benefit of the entire auto lending and leasing community, and we encourage you to join the center at autofinanceexcellence.org. There you'll be able to receive more content and insights on the best practices in auto finance. Please note that details on accessing the recording of this teleconference will be available on the Center for Auto Finance Excellence website as well as on autofinancenews.net. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Marcy Bellis. Marcy joined Royal Media Group in 1996. In 2001, she won an award from the Newsletter and Electronic Publishers Foundation for her coverage of GE Capital's exit from the auto finance business. Marcy's been covering the auto finance space for 17 years as senior editor of Auto Finance News and autofinancenews.net. She is involved in the Auto Finance Summit and Auto Finance Risk Summit and spearheads the Auto Finance Big Wheels Project and the Auto Finance Performance Initiative to quantify lender performance. And with that, Marcy?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Craig. I am excited to present today on behalf of the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. There's been a lot of activity in the collection sector, and I think a number of good ideas lenders can implement to improve and refine their operations. So let's get started. Here's a look at the agenda that I've got prepared. I want to mention a little more about the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. We'll go over some macro collection trends, plus take a look at recent delinquency performance. We'll talk about how compliance is shaping the collection space on multiple levels, or maybe even on every level. Then we'll get into the best practices portion, the 5 ideas for collection strategy improvement, and finally, I'll summarize the information and we'll take some questions. So as Craig and as JJ mentioned, the Center for Auto Finance Excellence was launched earlier this year with the support of Fiserv. The site is loaded with a library of articles on best practices. For instance, if you're looking for some guidance on how to create a better customer experience, the center has got information on that. If you need help devising a vendor management program, the center has got resources on that too. If you're curious about ideas related to hiring or to staffing, to payment innovation, The Center for Auto Finance Excellence is a valuable resource. I really encourage you to check out the site and sign up to become a member. Okay, to start, let's take a look at some of the macro trends that are influencing the collection space. For one thing, delinquencies have been on the rise. We'll get into that more in a few minutes, but for now, I think most would agree that late payments got to an artificially low level as a result of pre-credit crisis tightening. And some of the higher delinquencies we're seeing now are the result of normal, that is, not over-aggressive loosening of underwriting guidelines. But continued loosening will only pressure delinquency and charge-off levels higher. Now, as the auto finance industry picks up speed, lenders are accelerating their hiring efforts. Based on an informal survey we did, really just a look at postings from multiple job sites, LinkedIn, individual lender sites, companies are scouting out sales folks to navigate expansion into new territories, IT gurus to handle increasing tech initiatives, and, as expected, and as we'll talk about, collection execs to deal with the rising delinquencies. Here's an example. Westlake Financial Services has, last I checked, had 117 jobs listed on its website, and nearly 20% of them were for collection-related positions. Ally, United Auto Credit, Chase Auto Finance, and lots of other companies are looking to fill various collection spots. So competition is already stiff in the auto finance space, and it seems like it will only get tougher as lenders battle it out for new hires. On this slide, I pulled in some delinquency data from the American Bankers Association. The ABA tracks payments 30 or more days past due. I know some other sources track delinquencies 60 or more days past due, but for ABA, it's 30 or more days past due. And ABA tracks for direct and indirect auto loans, marine and recreational vehicles, plus mortgages, credit cards, and some other asset classes. On this chart, all I've got is the direct and indirect auto data. So as you can see, the delinquency rate on indirect auto loans, that's the blue line, inched up in the second quarter. And the second quarter is the most recent quarter for which the ABA has data. I think the third quarter data will come out next month. But that increase was the first time in 2 years that the rate has increased. Now, so the numbers. For the second quarter, the indirect loan delinquencies climbed 6 basis points, not a huge increase. But for some perspective, those numbers peaked at 3.53%, basically double, in the fourth quarter of 2008. Another point of comparison, from 2000 to 2007, the average delinquency rate was 2.17%. So we're still 45 basis points below that average. So that's, kind of the low that we had been talking about, the artificial low. Now, for direct loans, that's the red line, the delinquency rate fell 3 basis points to 0.88%. And as an aside, I think that's why a lot of lenders these days are eyeing the direct lending sector. Late payments and losses in that space are typically lower than they are for indirect, because consumers are usually the ones who initiate the loans themselves, and so they're often more invested in them. But overall, delinquency rates remain near historical lows and are unlikely to spike in the near term. Late payment rates are inching higher, especially as lenders loosen underwriting guidelines and intensify competition. Okay, so now a forecast. This slide is from the Auto Finance Forecast, which is a survey that we do 3 times a year to gauge lender expectations for the coming 12-month period. Whereas the ABA and other data sources provide something of a rear-view mirror type look at delinquency data, the Auto Finance Forecast asks lenders to predict where loan performance is headed. So in the auto finance forecast, we ask about predictions for auto loan and lease originations. We ask about net interest margins. We ask about the direction that loan underwriting will take, tightening, loosening. And for the origination piece, the expectation from the fall survey is growth of about 10% in the coming year. Now, we also ask about delinquency and charge-off data, or charge-off expectations, and those stats, too, are expected to grow between 1 and 10%, so grow meaning worsen, deteriorate somewhat. In the fall survey, though, there was a bit of an uptick of lenders who expect delinquencies to stay flat, and that's the higher blue line that you see, which is a good thing. And I left off the chart the minus 10%, minus 20% in delinquencies because we didn't have any responses with that expectation. Okay, now let's talk about the regulatory environment, which serves as the backdrop for financial services these days. So as most of you probably know by now, in early November, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR as it's called, related to debt collection rules. The main law that governs the industry and protects consumers is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA. But in 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act revised the FDCPA, making the CFPB the first agency with the power to issue substantive rules under the statute. So this debt collection ANPR was issued, I think it was November 5th, and you can find it on the CFPB's website. If you haven't looked at it yet, I would definitely encourage you to do so. It's about 100 pages long. It's divided into 9 parts. The ANPR looks for information on details related to debt sales and debt placements, and solicits information on disputes and investigations, among other things. There are a number of sections that deal with collector conduct and communication, specifically how collectors interact with consumers as they try to recover debts. And of course, there's information about UDAP, that's the Unfair, Deceptive, and Abusive Acts and Practices. That's just a sampling of what's in the document. Again, I encourage you to take a look through it, and note also that you can comment on the proposal until February 10th. In addition to the ANPR, the CFPB also made public last month its database of collection-related complaints. The CFPB had started to accept debt collection complaints in July, and as of November 27th, there were 7,442 complaints in the database. In fact, the CFPB's ANPR, the proposed rulemaking, was issued, like I said, on November 5th or 6th, and in the 3 weeks that followed, nearly 1,000 new complaints were filed. So about a 15% increase in the number of complaints in just 3 weeks. If you want to take a look at the complaint database, you can access it at consumerfinance.gov, that's the CFPB's website, /complaint database. And FYI, the site lets you sort the data and export it in multiple formats, so you can crunch the data in various ways. It's a pretty handy tool. Now, the complaints are largely categorized by subproduct, which is what you see here, including auto, credit card, federal and non-federal student loans, and a handful of others. There's also a large number of complaints that are unclassified, which means that the subproduct category is blank. They're just related to debt collection broadly. So here are the numbers. The biggest subcategory is actually labeled other. It includes things like health club memberships, phone contracts. There were nearly 2,400 complaints for the other subcategory. Next up is credit card, which garnered more than 1,700 complaints. And the unclassified category is next with about 1,500 complaints. After that, the numbers trail off. The auto subproduct generated 237 collection-related complaints. So you see it there, the blue bar, pretty low down on the list, which is good. Here I've got the complaint volumes by percentage. So you can see that auto comprised only 3% of the total volume, just behind mortgage, which was 5%, and on par with the student loans, both the federal and non-federal. The smallest percentage of complaints so far has revolved around payday lending. That was 1%. So with that backdrop of increased intensity on the regulatory front and rising delinquencies, where does that leave auto financiers? I think lenders are actually in a great position to make operational and procedural changes before delinquency trends rise too much or get out of hand. What does that entail? That's what we'll talk about next. The truth is that all 5 of the following ideas are tied in some way to the compliance landscape. Regulatory scrutiny has financiers taking very detailed looks at operations overall, which, while tedious and difficult, will probably have some far-reaching positive effects. So idea number 1, optimize communication. One of the areas the CFPB mentioned in the ANPR is communication tactics. In the CFPB's announcement about the proposed rulemaking, the agency wrote, and this is a quote, the CFPB wants to make sure that consumers are treated fairly and with respect by all debt collectors, regardless of whether the collector is the creditor, a collector working on behalf of the creditor, or a debt buyer or third-party debt collector. Now, under the FDCPA, debt buyers and third-party debt collectors are already prohibited from annoying, abusing, harassing consumers. But the CFPB is on the lookout for quote-unquote harmful communication tactics that are not specifically addressed by the FDCPA. And 2 of the items that CFPB mentioned specifically are better regulation of contact frequency and contact methods. The ANPR asks for feedback on whether new federal rules should limit debt collector contact, and if so, how to do it appropriately. The ANPR also asks for feedback on whether consumers are being harmed by collector communication using quote-unquote modern technologies like email and texting. As a lender that collects delinquent payments, you've got to think about the whole concept of maximum attempts. How many times per day do you call delinquent borrowers? If you're a bank, you've got to consider how many products the consumer has with your financial institution. And think about the different contact methods you use. Maybe your dialer makes 2 or 3 calls and you're sending an email plus a text message. You've got to make a policy of maximum attempts at the customer level. Currently, there's no legislation that defines what that is. The basic idea is to determine what your company considers appropriate and why you think that number is acceptable. One thing I think you'll find with the CFPB and other regulators these days is that they like to see a plan. Though they might not agree with every component or rationale of your plan, and I think they'll tell you so, they like to see one. And they like to see a plan that focuses on the consumer. Having a plan in place might be the difference between a slap on the wrist or a huge fine. The bottom line on this idea, don't overcall customers. Focus your efforts on the right people. You might bring in high-risk accounts on day 3, low-risk accounts on day 15, whatever the numbers are, and you might vary the intensity at which you call or reach out to those borrowers. How do you structure those efforts? What's your contact channel optimization? If you reach out to a customer 4 times a day, let's say it's 2 cell phone calls, one landline call, 1 email, is that the right formula? You have to have good analytics about what drives the contacts. Know that the communication channel that pulls the greatest response from customer A might be different than the communication channel that drives the greatest response from customer B. For customer A, 2 phone calls, a cell call, a text, that might be the best way to receive payment. For customer B, the best formula might be 2 letters and 2 landline calls. Along these lines, I think we might start to see a resurgence in the best time to call software. A few years back, that technology was pretty popular. Then I think penetration rates were increasing, so need for software to reach people declined. But now, as regulations start to tighten up, we might see more discussion around those kinds of systems. All right, idea number 2, review your incentive programs. We already mentioned that collection department staffing is on the rise for many lenders. One consideration related to that dynamic is the way lenders incentivize their collectors. The obvious piece is the collection portion of the equation, right? Which collector is bringing in the most dollars per hour? But how does compliance factor into your incentive plan? It's always been important to make sure you're rewarding proper behavior. These days, it's even more critical. A lot of lenders probably have some sort of judgmental procedure for gauging collector compliance. But how measurable is it? Can you grade how well your collectors are adhering to the appropriate procedures? For instance, you have a policy in place for handling repossessions. The collector must ask for the title, document it, send the information to another person in the organization. You have to be able to identify the policies and procedures in play, then determine whether, or maybe more accurately, to what degree, the collector followed those policies and procedures. You might create a scorecard to grade your collectors. Let's say you assign 50% of the score to collection effectiveness, that is to dollars collected per hour, and 50% to procedural adherence. You might have a collector who's tops when it comes to dollars collected, who's always gotten the highest incentive payout. But if you add in the compliance piece, his overall score could drop him down to 20th place. Then his incentive bonus wouldn't be the highest possible level. With the heightened regulatory scrutiny, you might even consider assigning a higher weight to the compliance piece of the incentive program. I leave that for you to decide, but it's really an important consideration. Okay, idea number 3, revisit TCPA guidelines. There's been a pretty significant change with regard to the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, the TCPA. First off, just a little background, the TCPA was enacted in 1991, and it prohibits auto-dialed calls to cell phones without the consumer's prior express consent. That's just one portion of it. Currently, the prior consent is not required in writing, but the FCC has proposed regulations that would require such consent to be in writing. And not only that, but the TCPA prohibits leaving a pre-recorded message for a consumer on a cell phone or on a residential line, for that matter, without prior consent. Okay, so I think there are a couple of schools of thought on the prior express consent issue. Some lenders have language in the credit application that the customer signs at the outset that says that any phone number he provides is fair game for contact. Others contend that you get the appropriate disclosure at the time of signing that you're authorized to call that number. Even if you get that, you have to get the express consent separately, that is at a separate time. So that would create a slowdown in productivity. Put another way, though your contract might say that it allows for calls from auto dialers, that wouldn't necessarily be considered the express consent necessary for lenders to use automated dialers to call cell phones. So practically speaking, what does this mean? You might have to reduce your dialer activity which would translate to more manual dialing and presumably increased staff. What can lenders do? One idea is to become more diligent in your welcome calls. Do them a little earlier, maybe 2 weeks after the transaction was completed, and get the express consent at that time. If the express consent is secured during the welcome call, then you can keep that recording and have it on file. In the meantime, though, scrub the phone numbers in your dialer and isolate any cell numbers. There are a lot of resources now you can use to identify cell phone numbers. Next, if you have express consent or can capture it, put an indicator in there. If you've got it, you can continue the auto dialing on that account. But for any number that's questionable, your best bet is probably to pull it out of your queue and work the account manually. Another consideration in securing that express consent is when the customer's phone number changes. In that case, you've got to get the permission again and then document it in your notes. So I just want to mention, though, that for issues related to TCPA, express prior consent, definitely check with your legal counsel. Like I said, there are different philosophies on it. But, you know, the fact is manual dialing might slow things down, but losses otherwise could be steep. Penalties for certain TCPA violations start at $500 per call, and in some cases can be tripled to $1,500 per call. So if you consider how many calls your collection department makes on a given day, I think the penalties could be severe. How long until these TCPA issues are resolved? Personally, I doubt anything will be resolved before 2015. So, you know, definitely something to consider as you work through the details of that. Now, idea number 4, this is something we mentioned, you know, we have resources for vendor management and vendor oversight on the Center for Auto Finance Excellence website. The goal with this one is that you manage your vendors to the same degree that you manage your own operations. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's first auto finance-related enforcement action zeroed in on vendor management procedures. The takeaway for lenders: beef up oversight of service provider partners or risk becoming the focus of CFPB's next enforcement action. Practically speaking, what should lenders do? Number 1, know your vendors. The most important thing auto lenders can do to prepare for a CFPB exam or investigation is to know its vendors and all the services they provide for your company. Also, review all documents. Make sure to review any documents providers use to interact with your customers. Monitor customer interactions. Be aware of the types of interactions vendors have with your consumers. If they're mailing letters, if they're signing agreements, charging fees, you had better understand what those fees are for and why they're being charged. Use clear language. Pay attention to language detailing marketing efforts, contract issues, fee explanations, and determine whether it might be misunderstood by consumers. Ultimately, the standard should be to ensure that everything is written in plain, understandable English. Okay, number 5, monitor fair lending. I'm guessing you're looking at this slide and thinking, fair lending, doesn't that have to do with loan originations? Since the CFPB was created, fair lending has been on its radar. According to the CFPB, disparate treatment occurs when a creditor treats an applicant differently based on a prohibited basis, such as race or national origin. But disparate impact occurs when a creditor employs seemingly neutral policies that have an adverse effect on a protected class. So yes, much of the discussion about fair lending revolves around identifying potential disparate impact, analyzing the terms on contracts on a dealer-by-dealer basis to determine if a dealer is charging higher rates to customers who are minorities or members of other protected classes. The CFPB and the Department of Justice look for discrimination at multiple levels. They look for it at the dealer level. They look for it across a finance company's aggregate portfolio. And if they find, quote unquote, statistically significant disparities at either level, lenders might have a problem. But now think about it from the back end of the process. Let's say you have two delinquent borrowers with similar characteristics whose accounts are being worked by two different collectors. In one case, the borrower asks for an extension or for a fee waiver, and it's granted. In the second case, for whatever reason, the same extension or fee waiver is not granted. This collection-related disparate impact issue seems like a reasonable extension of the fair lending that we normally talk about. And as such, it's an important area to consider as you work through your collection policies. Again, I want to stress, the idea of having a plan in place, being able to document, why things happen when. It's really critical. Okay, so just to review, we have the top 5 collection improvement strategies. Number 1, optimize communication. Figure out how frequently and by which communication channels you'll reach out to delinquent borrowers. Number 2, review incentive programs with a particular focus on procedural adherence. Number 3, revisit TCPA guidelines related to express prior consent and the use of auto dialers to reach consumers via their cell phones. Number 4, refine vendor oversight. Think of your service providers as an extension of your own company and manage them accordingly. And number 5, monitor fair lending for potential infractions of disparate impact. Now, aside from these 5 strategies, I want to mention 2 additional thoughts. The first involves a broad look at your overall collection operations with a focus on quantification. The goal is to be able to put numbers on every component of the process, to measure every component of the process. So here's an example. How long do you work an account before you turn it over to a third-party vendor? Or when do you compile a pool of loans and arrange a debt sale? The key is to properly segment your portfolio. Every loan should fall into a particular bucket, and you should be able to assign a value to each. Put simply, you should have buckets, let's say for low risk, medium risk, high risk, maybe charge-off and post-charge-off. Then you've got to figure out the value of those accounts. How many cents on the dollar are the accounts in each bucket worth? So if you get an offer from a third-party agency to buy a bucket of accounts, say for 23 cents on the dollar, you'll know if the offer is a good one. If the offer is for your medium risk pool of loans, let's say it's worth 20 cents on the dollar, you could go for it. If the offer is for 10 cents on the dollar, you'd probably want to pass. But you've got to be able to quantify it. You might argue that you've got very experienced and talented collectors who could look at loans one by one and determine their value. But those collectors can't do it easily for 10,000 loans at a time or 1,000 loans at a time. So for that, you've got to have analytics in place to be able to group similar loans. You've got to be able to reevaluate those loans regularly to determine when they fall into another bucket. And you've got to be able to reevaluate your buckets to decide when their overall value should change. That's just one example of the quantification idea. Every piece of the collection process should be analyzed in a similar way. This whole procedure is not something you can do in the course of a week or 2 weeks. It's an evolving process that you can accomplish over time. And I know that I'm not telling you anything new on that one, but the suggestion is that you take something you've already quantified and try to look at it with fresh eyes. Take one small process in your collection workflow and try to improve it. And sometimes the idea for improvement might be counterintuitive, but try to think outside the box a little bit. The procedures you have in place might be working just fine, but your goal is to make them work even better. The second thing I want to mention is the overall importance of a solid compliance structure company-wide. There are still a lot of question marks about how specific CFPB initiatives will play out. The precise definition of UDAP, of unfair, deceptive, and abusive acts and practices, what's unfair, what's deceptive, what's abusive, the direction the FCC will take with regard to written express prior consent, that lack of clarity reinforces the need for a strong compliance infrastructure. I know of many companies that have beefed up their compliance teams over the past year or so. They've redefined the reporting structure for compliance-related issues. Here's an example. I know of a company that used to manage complaints in silos. In other words, the complaint management function was decentralized. Essentially, each individual area would keep its own complaint logs. Members of that area would manage the complaints and work to resolve them. But in the past few months, the company has centralized that function. All complaints flow through the same channel, ultimately reaching a single individual, in this case, the general counsel. In a nutshell, compliance has really infiltrated every aspect of the collection space, and auto lenders must keep that in mind as they grow their businesses in this increasingly competitive market. The bottom line is that compliance changes related to collections are on the horizon at a time when delinquencies and charge-offs are on track to rise. You've got to have a solid infrastructure from procedural, collector, and compliance standpoints in place. You've got to consider how and how frequently you're reaching out to delinquent borrowers, and you really have to review all policies you have in place. That concludes my presentation. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. So we are going to open the call for Q&A. To ask a question, here's what you have to do. Raise your hand by going to the My Mood button and choosing Raise Hand. When it's your turn to ask the question, I will address you, and your line will be unmuted. So you just have to listen for the notification, line unmuted, and then you're free to ask your question. Once you finish your question, you will hear line muted, which signifies that you're no longer in the Q&A queue. And if you want to ask another question, just do it all over again. So with that, let's
all attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
All right. So if you have any questions, I'll give folks a few minutes or just a short time to line up. Let's see. And just one other thing I want to mention, you have my contact information. If anyone wants to contact me offline, you're certainly more than welcome to. An email, phone call, whatever works would be great. I'd be happy to hear any feedback too. Again, just to reiterate, if you have a question, go to the My Mood button at the top of the page, click raise hand, and that will signify that you have a question. I don't see any questions at the moment, but I'll give it one more minute and see if anyone has questions. The slides will be available, the recording should be available on the Center for Auto Finance Excellence website, so you're welcome to take a look at those after today, share them with colleagues. Again, I just urge you to check out the Center for Auto Finance Excellence website. It's really a valuable resource. So I don't see any questions at the moment. With that, I thank you all for participating in this webinar. The Center for Auto Finance Excellence is committed to bringing you quality content on best practices in auto lending and leasing, and we hope you join the center at autofinanceexcellence.org. Please be sure to keep an eye open for additional events from the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. Thanks once again to our partner Fiserv for their support. This concludes today's teleconference. You are free to disconnect. We hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.